Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the second session of the Biodiversity Academy. In this session, we'll focus on the Global Biodiversity Framework, the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework, and we have speakers from GYBN and Conservation International. With us, we have Sefa, Bella, and Kali. We'll start the session off with Sefa from GYBN. Sefa is an Ibalio Kanake indigenous youth from the Cordillera region in the Philippines. She's a policy coordinator for the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, GYBN, which and also serves as the youth constituency to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. She's also a UN Secretary General's Youth Advisor for Climate Change. Welcome, Sefa, and we give the stage to you.
Thank you so much, Eddie. I'll go ahead then and present. So today I'm going to be sharing a bit more about biodiversity policy, international biodiversity policy, specifically focusing on the UN Convention on Biological Diversity and the recently adopted Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Okay, so I'll start actually with a bit of a review from last time. Hopefully you've been able to make it. But just as a reminder, that biodiversity and climate change are two issues that are very much inextricably linked, right? This was a slide that was also in Melina's presentation, for example, and it shows us that biodiversity loss and climate change are impacting our quality of life and our survival. They are actually very much, of course, present in our lives as young people. And the social ecological crisis, as we know, is one of the greatest challenges that we are facing, and it's threatening our right to a safe, clean, and healthy environment. We also know that biodiversity loss worsens climate change, and that climate change is one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss. And both of these share many drivers at the surface, the direct drivers, which this includes land and sea use change, exploitation, and pollution, for example, and invasive species for biodiversity loss. But then at their roots, when we look at what is underpinning these direct drivers, they also share many of the indirect drivers or root causes, which comes, for example, with weaknesses in our institutions and governance, in the way that our economies are functioning, in our values, education and behaviors, and also in our technology. And so addressing both of these crises together will be essential if we want to continue if we want to ensure that we continue to live a good quality of life, right? So we know that biodiversity and climate change are very much linked, but they are still largely addressed in their own domains, at least internationally, right? So in the international policy level, we have the Convention on Biological Diversity, which deals with biodiversity, and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, which deals with climate change. And each of these also have their own mechanisms of being implemented, right? So we'll talk a bit later in more depth about the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And we might be familiar with the Paris Agreement under the UNFCCC. They also have their own domains in terms of the knowledge that is underpinning the policies that we have. For example, we have IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which assesses the available knowledge that there is about biodiversity and ecosystem services. And we might be more familiar with the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which does similarly assess the knowledge that is available to underpin our decisions in the climate change space, right? So they have been kind of largely functionally separate. The world has been dealing with them in many ways separately, but there are threats to addressing these two issues as completely separate, right? Because we then risk missing some of the things that connect them and implementing actions that could possibly cause false solutions for the other issue, for example, or prevent solutions from being the best that they can be. For example, there are many measures that are very much focused on climate change mitigation and adaptation, that if you don't properly consider its implications for biodiversity, it could cause a lot of unintentional challenges for nature and nature's contributions to people. For example, when monoculture plantations are being used to address as a climate solution, for example, this can have negative impacts on the resilience of the ecosystems, and therefore also on the contributions that this ecosystem has on the communities that rely on that ecosystem. For example, also a prevalent problem that we face in our community here in the Cordillera are renewable energy projects and dams that then cause a lot of negative impacts on the communities who live around the areas of the dams. So they risk submerging our communities, our burial grounds, our sacred sites. And this in turn would cause very negative impacts on the communities that are taking care of those areas, right, that are very high in biodiversity. And then if you narrowly focus on narrowly focus on conservation, on the other hand, you would still have some positive implications for climate change, but then it would not be as much as when you consider both together. Okay, so that's I suggest reading maybe this to get a better idea on the interplay between biodiversity and climate change. So this is a workshop report, a joint report by the IPBES and the IPCC, right? And we also talked last time about transformative change, which is that basically the science is telling us that if we want to address both climate change and biodiversity loss, we need transformative change or profound changes in the systems that underpin society. Okay, so I'll move on to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And I know this was also touched on last time, but just to remind everyone. So the Convention on Biological Diversity is an international agreement laying down broad consensus to protect biodiversity, right? And it also lays down what countries are obliged to do so that they can collaborate on addressing biodiversity loss. The Convention on Biological Diversity, or the CBD, so just remember this acronym. It has 3 objectives. The first is the conservation of biodiversity. The second is the sustainable use of biodiversity. So we can't just conserve biodiversity, right? We also have to use it, but we use it in a way that allows for future generations to also meet their own needs. So that's what we mean by sustainable use. And then the third objective is fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. So one of the key objectives of the CBD is to ensure that the benefits arising from biodiversity are shared fairly and equitably. This is because biodiversity is not equally distributed across the world, and also the means to, for example, make profits or non-monetary benefits from that biodiversity is also not shared equally. So usually biodiversity is found in developing countries, for example, while the means to, for example, make them into medicine is found more in developed countries. So part of what the CBD also tries to ensure is that those benefits are being shared fairly, right? And that's very important. So there are 196 parties to the CBD. It's pretty much every country in the world, except for the US and the Vatican. And this means that our countries, most of our countries, have this obligation to have agreed to oblige themselves to what they have agreed to in the CBD, so that we can collectively address biodiversity loss. So let me go into what those obligations are in a moment. But essentially, how the CBD is implemented, these kinds of international agreements also in general, is that they provide or they set actually goals and obligations for our national governments to implement. And our national governments have the obligation to then implement this at the national level through laws, conservation initiatives, integrating these into other sectors. And the main instrument for implementing the CBD is through what we call National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, or NBSAPs. So this is another acronym. So NBSAPs, or the National Plans for Biodiversity, all of our countries have this, and they are publicly available. So you can actually search what your country is doing for biodiversity, and after a certain period, they have to report back on their progress back to the CBD through what we call national reports. Okay, so if you have any questions, put them in the chat and we'll answer them later. Okay, so what are these goals and obligations actually that countries have agreed to, right? So one of them is what we call the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So right now, it's all a bunch of words, but I hope after this presentation, we'll have a better idea of what exactly these are. Okay, so the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is basically a global framework with goals and targets that governments and the whole of society should be implementing in order to reach the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature, right? So it's actually a document like this, and it has a vision and a mission, which we'll go through later, 4 goals, 23 targets, and other considerations like NBSAPs, what do we need for resource mobilization, what are some guiding principles that we need to follow, and things like that, right? So this agreement was negotiated for for 4 years under the Convention on Biological Diversity, and it was finally adopted in December of last year under the 15th Conference of the Parties of the CBD. Okay, so what's in actually the GBF? First, the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. It basically states that by 2050, biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and wisely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering benefits essential for all people. So this is our goal for 2050, our vision rather for 2050. And what the GBF, what the Global Biodiversity Framework aims to do by 2030 is to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, right? And it aims to do this, so it has some goals for 2050, and actually 23 different targets. But yeah, so at the high level, what the goals are first to ensure that ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity is conserved. The second goal, goal B, is to ensure that biodiversity is sustainably used and managed for present and future generations. Okay. Goal C is to ensure, again, that benefits from the utilization of genetic resources and traditional knowledge are shared fairly and equitably. So these roughly connect right with the 3 objectives of the convention. And then goal D is about making sure that we actually have the means, both financial and non-financial, to implement what we have set out to do. Okay. And then it has 23 targets, which we'll go through a bit more slowly. But as we go through them, I'm asking you guys to maybe reflect as we go along, like if there are any targets that I mentioned that you might already be contributing to through your work. Since these targets represent international obligations that our countries have agreed to, is there a way that you think we can use this to strengthen biodiversity and climate policies at different levels wherever you might be working more, and also implementation on the ground? Okay, so We'll go through those 23 targets, but not in too much depth because I'll try to link the full framework in a bit, or maybe one of the others can also link it in the chat. Okay. So targets 1 to 8 of the Global Biodiversity Framework refer more or less to addressing the direct drivers of biodiversity loss. So target 1, for example, is about addressing land and sea use change. And it aims to do this through ensuring that our areas are under spatial planning, and not just any spatial planning, but effective participatory spatial planning, right? Target 2 is about making sure that areas that are degraded are under effective restoration. And target 3 is about making sure that our protected areas and conserved areas are that we have effective and equitable protected and conserved areas. So you might also know this as the 30 by 30 target, which is a short way of saying that we want to protect and conserve 30% of our lands and waters by 2030 globally, right? And importantly, this target also ensures that that part of this target is recognizing indigenous and traditional territories as areas that are contributing to area-based conservation. Okay, any questions so far? I'll take them later maybe. So that's targets 1 to 3. Target 4 is about making sure that management actions for species recovery and conservation are in place, and to minimize human-wildlife conflict. So some of you might be working on species conservation. Target 5 is about preventing overexploitation through sustainable use and harvesting. So making sure that the way that we use, harvest, trade wild species is sustainable, but also ensuring that we respect and protect the customary sustainable use by indigenous peoples and local communities, right? Target 6 is about addressing the impacts of invasive alien species. So some of you might be aware of some invasive species that might be around your community. So ensuring that we manage the impacts and actually the species also themselves to ensure that they don't cause further harm to biodiversity. Target 7 is about reducing pollution, reducing pollution from many different sources, like water pollution, air pollution, the risk from pesticides and hazardous chemicals, and also plastic pollution. Okay, and then target 8, which is very relevant to the nexus between climate change and biodiversity, is about making sure that we minimize the impacts of climate change on biodiversity, and also making sure that we minimize the impacts of climate actions on biodiversity. So is anyone contributing to one of the first 8 targets? Let us know in the chat. We'd be really interested to know what young people are already doing, right, to contribute to our global targets. Okay, so targets 9 to 13 are about meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing. These are more the ones that are related to now, like the second objective of the convention, which is sustainable use. So target 9 is about making sure that we sustainably manage wild species and protect customary sustainable use so that they can continue to provide benefits for people, especially those in vulnerable situations. So we know, for example, that that indigenous peoples and local communities, women, young people, are groups that are in vulnerable situations. So this target aims to ensure that we are making sure that all of these groups also benefit from nature's contribution. Target 10 is about making sure that agriculture, aquaculture, fisheries, and forestry are being managed sustainably. As we know, if they are managed unsustainably or if they're done in the wrong way, they could cause a lot of harmful effects for biodiversity and also for people. Target 11 is about restoring, maintaining, and enhancing nature's contributions to people, or you may be more familiar also with ecosystem functions and services. Like so this includes the regulation of air, water, and climate, pollination, for example, disaster risk reduction, and things like that. Target 12 is about increasing the area quality connectivity of green and blue spaces. Many of us as young people live in urban areas. I also do. So this target is particularly interesting to me because I recognize that green and blue spaces in my city, for example, is very much important, not just for a good quality of life in the city, but also making sure that we have spaces to connect with nature, right? Which is more and more difficult to find when you live in the city. And then target 13 is making sure that we fairly and equitably share the benefits from genetic resources. So things like genetic sequences are used all the time to make into products or medicine or food and other things like that. And then also on tradition, and also like these are sometimes identified through traditional knowledge. So making sure that we this is a policy that ensures that those are shared fairly and equitably, including through communities, to communities rather, and that will increase the benefits being shared. So is anyone contributing to 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, maybe? Let us know again in the chat. And then for the last group of targets, which I'm very much interested in, are called tools and solutions for implementing and mainstreaming. So these now deal with more of the underlying drivers of biodiversity loss. So we have target 14, which is essentially about biodiversity mainstreaming. So mainstreaming is a term that refers to how biodiversity needs to not just be dealt with in the biodiversity space or by the environmental ministry, for example, but instead actually biodiversity is relevant across different sectors and at all levels of government. And so we need to integrate biodiversity and its multiple values. So not just its monetary value, but its value to our culture, recreation, spiritual, cultural, things like that, into our policies, regulations, planning, and development processes. So this is a very important target. And it's easier said than done, of course. Target 15 is about reducing the negative impacts from businesses on biodiversity, including by making sure that we have the policy measures, the legal measures, to ensure that that businesses and especially large and transnational companies are disclosing their impacts on biodiversity, that they provide information that consumers need to make sustainable consumption decisions, and then also to report on their compliance with access and benefit sharing. Okay. Target 16 is about enabling sustainable consumption. And we know that this includes policies, but also improving education in general, right? Making sure we have access to relevant and accurate information and also alternatives, which is not equally distributed also across different groups. And we reduce the global footprint of consumption. Target 17 is about strengthening biosafety measures. So making sure that biotechnology, that we have the right measures in place to prevent adverse impacts from biotechnology and increase positive impact. So when we talk about biotechnology, for example, we have what we call GMOs, or also living modified organisms, products of synthetic biology that could possibly have far-reaching implications far into the future. So we need to ensure that we take precaution and ensure that those are prevented or mitigated. Target 18 is about eliminating harmful subsidies. So making sure that we identify, phase out, and hopefully eliminate subsidies that are harmful for biodiversity, which is very much okay, sorry, I got my 5 minutes. So this is a big big driver of biodiversity loss. So we need to phase those out and instead put them into positive incentives for biodiversity. Okay. Target 19 is about financial resources for implementation. So making sure that we increase the financial resources to actually implement what we have set out to do. They have identified a biodiversity financial gap. And so this target obliges or is part of the obligations related to this target is to ensure that developed countries meet their financial obligations to developing countries, that we mobilize domestic and private and other financial sources, that we synergize financing on biodiversity and climate, and that we enhance the role of collective actions, including by indigenous peoples and local communities. Okay. Then we're going through the last 4 targets. So target 20 now is about ensuring that not just finances are available, but also capacity building, technology transfer, technical and scientific cooperation is available. Target 21 is about making sure that we have all the information that we need to make effective and equitable decisions. So this includes communication, awareness raising, education, monitoring, research and knowledge management, and also, of course, traditional knowledge, which will only be accessed with free, prior, informed consent of the communities. Okay. Target 22 is about respect for human rights, in essence. It's about actually ensuring that indigenous peoples and local communities, women and girls, and young people have access to participation in decision making, and also access to justice and access to information when it comes to biodiversity. It also includes ensuring that indigenous peoples and local communities' rights to land are being respected. Also, persons with disabilities, and then very important is the full protection of environmental human rights defenders, which, as we know, are being increasingly threatened for their work to be on the front lines, protecting our biodiverse areas, right? So this is very much unprecedented in global international biodiversity policy. So in the past, there have been more regional agreements that protect environmental defenders, but now we have it in an international policy. And then target 23 is about gender responsive implementation. So making sure that we ensure gender equality when we implement the framework and respect the rights of women and girls. Okay, so let me just go to this section, which is about youth and the global biodiversity framework, right? So we actually, in the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, or GYBN, are a global network who are acting together to lead and support and accelerate transition to a society that lives in harmony with nature. And another role that we play, aside from our chapters doing work all around the world, is to be the international coordination platform or youth constituency to the Convention on Biological Diversity. Okay, so this is our global community. You can kind of see where we have chapters. And for the past 4 years, we have been collectively advocating for youth priorities to be in the global biodiversity framework through, for example, our Stop the Same campaign, which calls for transformative change, and just in general, youth consultations, youth campaigns, youth communication, education, and things like that. And it has produced a lot of results. So let me just share with you that we had been advocating strongly for intergenerational equity, full and effective youth participation, transformative education, and human rights-based approaches in the framework, and most of them have gotten in. So it's important to just mention that the framework, of course, like through collective action, not just of young people, but also with other NGOs, with parties, with indigenous peoples and women, we have gotten many of our priorities into the framework, right? So we have intergenerational equity, for example, as a cross-cutting consideration for implementation. Target 22, as I mentioned, mandates governments to ensure that we have full and effective participation, access to justice and information, and that we protect environmental defenders, many of whom are young people. We have a paragraph stating that we need transformative education on biodiversity, informal, non-formal, and informal educational programs, right? And that we need a focus on values that are consistent with living in harmony with nature. We have a cross-cutting consideration on a human rights-based approach, which is great, and also a mention on the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. It recognizes very strongly the contributions and the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, and including in the target relating to protected and conserved areas, right? Which we might know has caused some, or actually like historically caused conflict with indigenous peoples and local communities. And hopefully this will help to kind of create accountability for those past injustices and create a more just pathway forward. And then, of course, very strong considerations for gender. So just to conclude, maybe, is that our assessment of the framework is that it really does contain many transformative elements that strongly reflect the links between our social issues, social inequalities, and biodiversity loss. And it includes, as I mentioned, many of our priorities that we collectively as civil society and also with the support of governments have been advocating for a long time. But it does lack, it does have some weaknesses, like a lack of accountability and regulation for businesses. So that's something to keep in mind. And it also lacks ambition in terms of how much resources developed countries are providing to developing countries. And that there is language in it that could possibly be misused for false solutions. For example, we're very much concerned by biodiversity offsets and credits and possible misuse of nature-based solutions. And these are things that I think will be discussed in another session. So just to finish up, our next steps, and also for GYBN and also for young people in general, is to really continue and scale up what young people are already contributing to the targets, which I see that many of you have put in the chat what you guys, which targets you are already contributing to. Oh my gosh, sorry. And then to participate in the updating of the national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Now that the GBF has been adopted, they're now in the process of adapting this to the national level. So to continue campaigns, capacity building, mobilization, and community building, and of course, demanding from our governments that they comply with the obligations that they set out to do through the framework effectively and equitably. So that's it. I'll try to answer questions when we get to the Q&A session, and thank you so much. Back to you, Ryan.
Thank you so much, Sefa, for your presentation. I see already so many questions and so much engagement in the chat discussing on what goal they're working on and how to collaborate more. We're now moving to a short 5-minute break before we move on to the presentation by Bella and Kali. We'll see you guys back in 5 minutes. We'll be starting in about 1 more minute. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining in again. We're moving on to the next presentation by Bella and Kali from Conservation International. Bella Thacker is an international policy coordinator at Conservation International. She focuses on biodiversity policy, working with governments to design and implement nature-positive policies, whereas Kali is the manager of international policy at Conservation International. She supports institutional work on biodiversity policy with a focus on ensuring the places most important for providing nature's contribution to people are conserved. Thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. My name is Bella Pucker, and as previously mentioned, I'm the coordinator of international policy at Conservation International, and I work closely with Carly Siege, who is a manager of international policy. And Carly and I both work in the global policy and government affairs division at Conservation International. And in our role, we supported the negotiation process that led up to the agreement and adoption of the Global Biodiversity Framework last December. And then since then, our work has pivoted to implementing the framework, primarily through working with governments around the world to translate the goals and targets of the framework into national biodiversity policy. All right, so we're going to start off by setting the stage. The biodiversity crisis is talked about less often than the climate crisis, so it's known by some to be a silent crisis. That said, there are 1 million animal and plant species threatened with extinction by 2030. And in order to address this crisis, there's an immense funding gap, estimated at around $700 billion annually until 2030. The biodiversity crisis does not exist in a vacuum. In fact, it's deeply linked with the climate crisis. And fortunately, the solutions to these twin crises, as they're often referred to, are mutually reinforcing. So protecting nature is a win-win for both biodiversity and the climate. So the Convention on Biological Diversity, or the CBD, is tasked with chipping away at this global issue that I outlined in the previous slide. So the CBD is part of the Rio Convention, along with the UNFCCC, or the Climate Convention. And the three objectives of the convention, as previously mentioned, are conservation, sustainable use, and sharing of benefits. Unlike the UNFCCC, or the Climate Convention, the CBD takes place every 2 years instead of annually. So the 15th Conference of the Parties, or COP15, took place last December. It was delayed due to COVID, and it was supposed to take place in 2020 in Kunming. And the CBD COPs have historically been a good amount smaller than the climate COPs. But that said, at COP15, there was a very large turnout from governments, civil society, and the private sector, probably larger than any CBD COP previously. So after hard and long negotiations, at the final hours of the meeting in the middle of the night, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, or the GBF, was adopted. And so this replaces the Aichi targets, which were the world's last set of biodiversity goals, which spanned from 2010 to 2020. And the GBF sets the 10-year trajectory for how the world will halt and reverse the biodiversity crisis. So what happens now? We have this framework, but the GBF is only really as strong as it is implemented on the ground. So it's now time to translate the text into national policy and action. So there's a mandate for countries, as shown in this slide, to draft national policies from the GBF that align with the global goals of the GBF. And this element was missing from the Aichi targets and may have contributed to the perceived failure of those targets in many regards. So countries are tasked with drafting these national targets, and then from these targets, countries are to develop their national biodiversity strategy and action plans, or NBSAPs. And so NBSAPs outline a country's strategies, action plans, programs, and policies for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And NBSAPs can be thought of as the sister to nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, under the climate agreement. And NBSAPs, or at the very least, a country's national targets, are due at the next CBD COP next year in 2024. So another aspect of implementation is tracking progress. And in order to track progress towards what's laid out in an NBSAP, countries need to submit national reports. And these are documents for parties to monitor and review meeting the goals of the GBF through actions in their NBSAPs. And Carly will cover this later on. And so far, countries have submitted 6 national reports, and the next one is due in 2026. So all of these documents, the NBSAPs and the national reports, feed into a global assessment of progress on GBF implementation. And this is similar to the global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. And the first global assessment will take place at COP17, and then the second will take place at COP19. So here we have a very high-level timeline from now until 2030. And 2030 is the point where the GBF will expire and a new 10-year framework will be adopted. The blue on this slide is all the activities related to the CBD, and then the green is all the activities related to the UNFCCC. And as you can see, the Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDC, update process and the NBSAP update process are on slightly different timescales, with the NDCs due every 5 years. So the first year and a half after COP15, which is the window we're in now, is really a key window for governments as they are revising their National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans, or NBSAPs. So right now, countries are tasked with using this time to take stock of their existing plans and then update their NBSAPs before COP16 next year. I also wanted to point out that between these meetings on this slide, there are meetings of the subsidiary bodies to the convention. So these are intersessional meetings, and the CBD has 2 subsidiary bodies. One is called SBSTA, which deals with the technical aspects of the convention, and then the other is called SBI, which handles matters related to implementation. So I'm now going to pass it over to Carly, who will provide some more insight on how the elements that I just covered can foster links to climate.
Hi, sorry about that. Thank you so much, Bella, for that amazing overview, and Sefa for the great understanding of the goals and targets of the GBF in the previous presentation. Because we got such an in-depth understanding of what each of the goals and targets are, Bella and I decided to focus our presentation on the other elements that were adopted at COP15 that make up the entire GBF. So in addition to the GBF itself, which is the global goals and targets, there is a monitoring framework, which Bella mentioned, and a plan for filling in that 700 billion biodiversity finance gap within the resource mobilization package. And each of these elements have several entry points for climate and biodiversity linkages to be fostered. Starting with the 4 global goals, Goal B, as we learned about in the previous presentation, is meant to make sure that nature's contributions to people, so ecosystem services, are maintained for future generations. And it is well understood that nature's contributions to people include nature's role as a climate solution. And a very basic example would be how the global hydro cycle goes throughout the world, and El Nino and El Nina all work together to keep temperatures kind of the same, weather kind of the same, and all of those things impact our, experience of climate change. So that's a very broad example, but this is one way that, in a very overall way, climate change and nature are linked in this framework. When you get into the targets, there are at least 5 that have direct contributions to climate mitigation. So the first is Target 2 on restoration. Here, countries agreed to restore 30% of degraded areas by 2030. And the target language encourages that this restoration is done in a way that enhances biodiversity and ecosystem services, which again include climate services. So an example of this would be focusing restoration efforts on mangroves. If the country that we're talking about has mangrove ecosystems, those are things that can be restored with very recent and scientifically based approaches that will both contribute to this target 2, as well as countries mitigating of climate change, because mangroves sequester or store carbon at a much higher rate than other kinds of ecosystems. For target 3, 30 by 30, the commitment to conserve 30% of the planet by 2030, the same thing applies. So efforts to conserve or set up protected areas or other effective mechanisms of conservation, or OECMs, can be done in places that provide climate benefits. Again, mangroves, they can decide to conserve them. Tropical forests, prioritizing those forests for the target 3 is a climate contribution. Target 8 is the overarching climate target, and this one has the most obvious and direct linkages with climate. It is meant to increase the resilience of nature to climate change and foster ways that nature can support climate mitigation. And one of the approaches listed in the target is nature-based solutions, which is pretty much what we've been talking about for target 2 and 3, the restoration or conservation of places that are very important for climate benefits. Target 10 relates to sustainable production, so forestry, agriculture, aquaculture, and all of those systems rely on nature for their maintenance. Agriculture cannot survive without pollination. But also climate change is a huge risk to current levels of agricultural production. So there are ways to manage production systems in a way that both reduces their climate impact and makes them more resilient to climate change. So that's how we see the connection for target 10. And lastly, target 11 is an overarching target on the maintenance of nature's contributions to people overall, which, as we now all agree, includes climate services. So the monitoring framework is a really important way that these climate linkages will be made into realities on the ground. The monitoring framework was adopted at the same time as the GBF to correct what happened with the Aichi targets, where there was not a set way of monitoring progress on the targets at the time of adoption, leading to very different ways of countries measuring their progress, and the world being unable to calculate all of those different aspects and elements together to get a real sense of our achievement. So the GBF corrects this by having a preliminary monitoring framework that Bella will get to in a couple other slides about how that monitoring framework is still being developed. But what we currently have already has indicators that will help countries make sure that their actions on the targets listed here impact climate positively. So one of the key ones is climate regulation services provided by ecosystems. So by asking countries to monitor that, we are saying that that your work with ecosystems needs to create climate regulation services. Similarly, these indicators have a lot of similarities with the same kind of indicators countries will be using to calculate their contributions to the climate convention. So the overall goal of that, as I'm pretty sure we're all familiar with, is keeping temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the contributions to that are quantified mitigation reductions or emissions reductions using national global greenhouse gas inventories. And so the fact that the country's GHG inventories are a key indicator for this framework is a really important linkage that we're hoping to see fostered as countries implement this framework and use the monitoring framework. Lastly, another really important improvement the GBF made to the Aichi targets was a resource mobilization plan, again, at the same time as adoption. The world really struggled with meeting the Aichi targets, one, because they were really ambitious, and two, because there was not ambitious financing commensurate with how ambitious the targets were. So the GBF really wanted to respond to that by putting mechanisms in place to make sure that countries are able to make good on these promises. And one of the ways that they have identified for mobilizing these finances is optimizing synergies with climate finance. Climate finance, such as through REDD+, which is the reducing emissions through deforestation and forest degradation, and other mechanisms that are already in play that allow more finance to flow from both private and public sources. So these elements are really key for understanding how the implementation of the GBF will contribute to climate mitigation. And it's important to see that it's set at the international level as a threshold, so that at least at the international level, we're hoping that progress can be captured in a way that we can understand how these actions support climate mitigation. All right, I will pass it back over to Bella. Oh, sorry, no, I'm keeping it to myself. I will keep it to myself to talk a little bit more about the monitoring framework. So again, the Aichi targets were really hard to meet because we didn't have a way to monitor them. And so this monitoring framework aims to correct that. At COP15, parties were unable to have a full monitoring framework ready. And by full, I mean with an indicator for each of the targets. And so at COP15, a group called the Ad Hoc Technical Advisory Group was established to kind of finish out how that monitoring framework will be structured. And one of the items on their mandate is a final indicator for Target 8, which is that climate one that is meant to foster nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches to maintain nature's contributions to people that are climate change related. And so without a set indicator on that, it will be very hard to mandate countries acting on this in a very specific way without the actual obligation to use a headline indicator or a mandatory indicator to track that progress. So as Bella mentioned, there are subsidiary bodies to this convention, and they actually just met to continue their work on this framework. It is still being decided, and there will be another meeting of the subsidiary bodies in May, because countries made it very clear that they need to have a full monitoring framework, including an indicator on Target 8 by COP16, so that they can appropriately share their progress on this work. Then in terms of the implementation mechanism, this is overarching guidance that the COP, or the Conference of Parties, adopted to support countries in writing and updating these national strategies. This is another improvement from Aichi. There was very little guidance when that was adopted on how national policy had to align with the ambition set in Aichi. This is corrected here. The entry points into climate are how progress will be captured in the global report that will feed into the global review of progress, aka the sister to the global stocktake under the climate convention. So we're hoping that the way progress is measured is in a way that is complementary to the way progress is measured for the global stocktake, so that we can see how party action on both commitments contributes to the overall goal of living in harmony with nature. So again, another group was established to kind of speed up this work, try to get some language on paper. They'll be meeting again at this next subsidiary body meeting in May. So hopefully have finalized guidance by COP16, when the first updated NBSAPs are due. So overall, we are trying to make the case that in addition to the GBF, the other implementation, monitoring, and resource mobilization elements adopted at COP15 are really important for fostering climate linkages at the national level. Obviously, targets 8 and 11 are the ones that we expect to see the most direct contributions made towards the climate agenda. But as we said in the previous slide, there are several other targets and elements that can be used to foster these linkages. And now we would like to show you some of that underlying science on how action to support biodiversity does fundamentally support climate mitigation. So I will pass it back over to Bella for this part.
So when you think about where the carbon stores in nature are that we must protect to avoid climate catastrophe, we're thinking about tropical forests, mangroves and wetlands, and peatlands. And so the overlap between these high carbon ecosystems and these biodiversity rich areas are where we should prioritize action. And I'm going to show some maps in the next slide that make this point even stronger. All right, so irrecoverable carbon refers to the places that humanity cannot afford to lose if we want to avoid the catastrophic consequences of climate change. So scientists at CI, where we work, mapped where these critical stocks of carbon are around the world, and much of the world's irrecoverable carbon is found in the places that we just mentioned. So mangroves, peatlands, old growth and tropical forests, and marshes. And so when you overlay biodiversity areas with irrecoverable carbon, you get this map with the darkest areas being that overlap. And so the main finding from this map shows that 75% of the world's irrecoverable carbon and 87% of threatened species can be found in less than 14% of the Earth's land. So that shows us where we need to prioritize action in these places where high carbon ecosystems overlap with biodiversity. And our hope is that NBSAPs, or these national biodiversity plans, can prioritize action nationally in these places. So scientists at CI have also mapped the places that provide key services to people, such as soil health, pollination, climate mitigation, and so on. And so this map shows that 80% of the areas with critical local benefits to people also overlap with the areas that are beneficial for climate regulation. And so that the yellow here shows those areas that are beneficial to both local benefits and to climate regulation. And so based on this map and the one in the previous slide, it's clear from science that biodiversity and climate change are linked. And it's in these high carbon, very biodiversity rich areas that we should prioritize protection, conservation, and sustainable use. So it's now up to us and both the Climate Convention and the Biodiversity Conventions to make those linkages actionable for countries. All right, thank you so much. We have our contact information here, so you're welcome to contact either of us, but we're also excited to take questions and are very, very glad to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bella and Kali. I see a lot of questions in the chat already. Some of the ones that kept on popping up were about finance. One of the first questions for Sefa was, how do we ensure the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal, how that underpins justice for local communities, in particular reference to 30 under 30? We also wanted to know, how did we come up with the number 30 itself?
That's a good question, and I'm sure actually Bella and Carly might also be able to contribute. So with regards to this target, right, which is about 30 by 30, it is one of the more contentious ones because this number of how much, for example, of land would need to be under protection or conservation was heavily negotiated. So that's how that number came about, based on national priorities as well as scientific information. But how do we ensure that that justice underpins the implementation of 30 by 30 is a really good question. Through the advocacy of Indigenous peoples and local communities and other organizations, that target 3, has safeguards to ensure that when we create, for example, protected areas, these must ensure that we respect the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, including, for example, making sure that we respect free, prior, and informed consent when we create those areas. Free, prior, and informed consent means that we consult the communities in a way that they're not forced into anything, so it's free. Prior means you seek the consent before you actually implement. Informed means you give all the information they need to make the decision. And then consent means actually that they have the freedom to say yes or to say no. Doesn't mean that you have to push until they say yes. So when we talk about protected areas in particular, which is the conservation measure that has caused conflict in the past for Indigenous peoples and local communities, we need to ensure that the implementers of these measures, which are mostly governments, right, and also, for example, mostly big conservation NGOs, that they follow a rights-based approach, which means not only do they have to not violate human rights, but they also play a role in ensuring that human rights are protected, respected, and promoted. Right. So it will be, there are many organizations that are, of course, pushing for these kinds of policies at the national level. big conservation NGOs, I hope, are also kind of putting in place their own measures to ensure these in their own internal policies. And then there are also, of course, external organizations who are watching for any violations that might happen in this regard. So that's what I have to say on that.
Thank you, Sefa. If Bella and Kali also would like to come in.
Just to reiterate everything Sefa said, I think that's exactly right. As we're working with countries on their NBSAPs, their National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans, I think what's most important is that communities and Indigenous peoples are never an afterthought, but they're involved from the outset. And so they're involved in actually drafting the NBSAPs, but then also in the implementation, which is exactly what Sefa said with free, prior, and informed consent. So it has to really start from the very beginning. They can't just be brought in at the end for implementation.
100%. And another echoing of what Sefa said, with a reminder that because Target 3 allows for the recognition of Indigenous lands as a contribution to 30 by 30, one way that we are hoping to see countries make good on this is by reviewing their tenure rights and overall IPLC rights policies they have on the books to make sure that the enabling conditions are set to actually recognize those lands by the correct tenure holders. So that's one way that we are hoping 30 by 30 implementation does not contribute to the history of fortress conservation that has been done in the name of, stopping biodiversity loss.
Thank you so much. I saw a lot of comments from Louis Lowe. Hope I'm pronouncing your name right. So I would invite them to ask their questions.
Hello, this is Louis. So thank you so much for the great presentation. I have learned so much today. So I'm actually from Hong Kong, and then I'm working in the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. So I'm working for the actually I'm working at the exact biodiversity position right now. And from what I learned, I only been in this industry for maybe 2 years. But then the concept of carbon credits is helping biodiversity is always buggle me, because how come carbon credits is only measuring the carbon, but then some people, if they only measure about the carbon, they may introduce more exotic species that is capturing more carbon, but then they are providing less biodiversity value to the area. And do you think that this is something we should worry about? Like, carbon credit is such a hot topic around the world now, but then people are neglecting the damage that carbon credit can do to the biodiversity. And then also, apart from carbon credits, is there any other tools that in the climate finance that can help with the biodiversity method? Like from where I'm working at, like a university college, is there any tools we can use to help us? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
All right, I'll try to take the first stab at that. Yes, there is a wealth of information about how carbon crediting mechanisms are not supporting biodiversity. There are also a lot of efforts going on to ensure that safeguards are in place under carbon crediting projects to ensure that both cultural and socioeconomic biodiversity standards are kept. There's a lot of room for improvement. And there's also a lot of room for the proliferation of guidance on how to create carbon projects that specifically support biodiversity benefits as well as climate benefits. And there's one example of that under VERA, which is one of the carbon crediting methodologies that is specifically on climate and biodiversity benefits. Again, a lot of room for improvement, but it's a first step that we have. And I think it's really, really important to note here that the $700 billion biodiversity finance gap is not going to be filled by carbon crediting alone. Carbon crediting, that finance mainly comes from the private sector. And what we have found is that public sector financing, so bilateral aid from governments, is where the largest or the second largest chunk of that money will flow. And the actual largest chunk, so 500 billion of the 700 billion, is actually already being spent by governments on subsidies that are harming nature. So by stopping that, we don't need to pay that $500 billion. So it really shrinks the entire gap significantly. So CI, where Bella and I work, are endeavoring to learn more about examples of positive subsidies. So an example of a negative subsidy would be a government, stipend to explore mining in certain areas. And so a positive subsidy would be maybe instead of mining, it could be agroforestry. And so we're now looking for specific policy examples of those positive incentives that we can use as examples for other countries as they, try to lower the amount that is being spent on subsidies and incentives that are harming nature and then reform them so that they are supporting nature. I also see a question in the chat about biodiversity credits, and I would really like to not get into that. I am not an expert on that subject, and I don't want to lead anyone astray. So that's where I will stop.
I'll just add that I believe these schemes will be tackled in another session of the Biodiversity Academy. So definitely tune into that. But it's good to stay critical of, I believe like it's always good to stay critical, especially about market-based approaches that might not necessarily align with addressing, the systemic root causes of biodiversity loss. Because in many cases, these are very much still feeding into the same system. And as we said, right, we need transformative change. And it's good to recognize when these ways of financing biodiversity are actually part of the problem rather than really being a true solution. So it's great that you are staying critical of that. And I encourage everyone to join the session that would specifically talk about this. And also to examine the evidence of whether these are working or not. Because while they might sound good, many of them are actually not proven to actually, create any real outcomes.
Also, last thing just to add on is that the credits are just one piece of a broader pie of funding mechanisms that will fund the GBF. So many of you, I think I saw in the chat, have probably heard of the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, which was a new fund established at the COP to quickly disperse resources from all sources. It's housed under the GEF. And that will complement other existing sources. So Carly mentioned the official development assistance from developed to developing countries, amongst other mechanisms such as the incentives that Carly mentioned as well. So while it's, yes, important to be critical of credits and explore that topic, there's also a variety of other financing sources that will work to fill the $700 billion annual funding gap.
Thank you so much. I also saw a couple of questions from Rihanna Thomas on the recent SAFSTA that ended. Rihanna, are you able to unmute?
Hi, yes, Rihanna Thomas from Guyana. I just wanted to hear if it's like thoughts, reflections, and someone mentioned of their recently concluded SAFSTA 25 held in Nairobi. What were the youth thoughts, your and reflections of the meeting?
Thank you, Rina, and for that question. So given plans to hold a webinar on the outcomes of this meeting soon, so stay tuned for that when I'll probably be able to form more complete thoughts. But so for everyone's information, this meeting dealt, for example, with climate change and biodiversity as one of the agenda items. And under that item, it's still very much an ongoing discussion as to how the CBD, for example, will treat nature-based solutions, and how, many other issues such as it will also discuss climate and biodiversity finance, for example. What else? So these issues that we're talking about now are also still being the subject of negotiations under the CBD. So it would be these are ongoing that will continue until the next SAFSTA and the next COP. So it's good to keep informed about those. I don't have my complete reflections yet. And other issues that were discussed at the previous SAFSTA were, for example, how the CBD can take into better account the outcomes from the assessments developed by IPBES on values and sustainable use. And also the IPCC 6th assessment report is also being considered. So the SUBSTA is actually the body of the CBD that deals with which receives technical and scientific advice, and how this scientific and technical advice can be used to better make the decisions under the CBD better, right? So since IPBES and IPCC play such big roles in providing a lot of that solid scientific base, this is also being discussed under the CBD. Our positions on this were that it's very much important to consider the conclusions of IPBES, that the diverse values of nature, the multiple values of nature, not just the monetary ones, should be included. In fact, there should be much more emphasis on those values that are not related to what we take from nature. Instead, we should kind of be guided more by relational values and how the place of like people within nature, and also cultural, spiritual values and things like that. So maybe those two I'll share. Those were the two that we as youth were following the most during the recently concluded subs.
Thank you
But
so
yeah,
much,
we'll
Sefa.
share, maybe we can share with Ayadi the information about our webinar on the youth outcomes from that meeting.
Thank you. I saw Carly also shared the document from CI, which you also want to jump in.
Yeah, so I put our readout in the chat here, which covers the 3 major issues that we followed throughout the negotiations. And I think it's a great example of the ecosystem of civil society that the CBD has allowed a voice in the room, because we, Sefa and I both represent civil society organizations that have completely different mandates and completely different, scopes of work. And so it's really important that both of us, as well as all of the other constituencies, have a voice at these meetings to make sure that the specific goals of all of the different parts of our society are well heard at these negotiations. So I just wanted to call out that, and glad to see you at all these negotiations. The 3 issues that we captured or that we covered were the ones that I discussed in our presentation relating to the monitoring framework, the global review of progress, and overall climate and biodiversity, all 3 of which have further topics to be discussed. As I mentioned, the monitoring framework is still unfinished. There are still targets that do not have an obligatory indicator. With regards to the global review of progress, there are still questions to be answered around what exactly the report will cover, what metrics will be used, and how that will feed into the review and socialization of progress that countries have made on the GBF. And lastly, on climate and biodiversity, pretty much everything that you have been putting in the chat is still up for debate. And overarchingly what the CBD's role is on providing guidance on these topics, and if there should be further collaboration with the UNFCCC or the Climate Convention at both the executive secretary or head level and the technical level. So we'll be attending the next subsidiary body meeting in May and hoping to see more progress on these points.
Thank you so much. I now invite Antonio to ask his question on management and monitoring systems. Antonio, are you there?
My question was on if do you know any examples in any countries or any jurisdictions such as the European Union on biodiversity criteria compliance for companies or enterprises that help to the authorities to have a monitoring or to track the evolution of the meeting the targets of the coming framework or something. This is my question arises from a point of view from the taxonomy that needs to have how do you call evidence on how are you carrying with the criteria, how are you meeting these criteria, and how do you prove that you're doing it right?
So I just put a link in the chat that I think would really be useful for you, Antonio. There's an organization called Business for Nature that's really leading the civil society efforts around working with the private sector and creating those metrics and guidance. It's not something that I am personally an expert on. It's not something that my organization is really focusing on, but I would highly suggest you check out their page. They have a lot of webinars coming up about their work, working with companies to figure out what they want to disclose, how they want to disclose it, and how to make sure that lack of disclosure is enforced. And if they disclose that they're really impacting nature negatively, how you can enforce them changing that. So it's a really dynamic space that Business for Nature is creating, and I'd suggest you check it out.
Just to add also, so the CBD mainly creates obligations for governments and not for businesses. That said, it's a framework for the whole of society, and like, of course, businesses are very much encouraged to comply with their obligations. There are different, I think, yeah, this is also not my field of expertise, but there are many like standard setting bodies on how businesses should be complying with their obligations with regard to this. There's also some frameworks that monitor their disclosures on their dependencies on biodiversity. And aside from that, as Bella and Carly talked about, the Global Biodiversity Framework itself has indicators for that basically measure how we're the progress that we're making towards each of those targets that I mentioned, including the one on businesses. Some of those indicators don't quite yet exist. They're still being developed, but hopefully they'll be in place soon. And hopefully they'll be meaningful, good indicators that actually measure what we want to measure, right? Because that's going to be a big part of what will also guide the implementers on what needs to be implemented. So yeah, this is a process that's ongoing, and we're happy to kind of share updates as we go along this process of developing indicators.
Thank you so much, Sefa. And I think we can have one more last question from Timothy on mainstreaming. Timothy, are you here? Okay, if not, Timothy's question was, how can we mainstream these lofty and important conversations into locally led and subnational implementation on a regional basis?
I think part of it is what Sefa mentioned, that this framework is a whole of society approach. So it's not just meant to take place in the governments or businesses or communities, but all of those combined, which I think is beautiful and great, because it's no longer just environmentalists that are advocating for sustainable solutions. But I think the rest of the world is waking up to the fact that climate and biodiversity solutions are actually win-wins for people and nature and the economy and the climate and health, and that list goes on.
Thank you so much, Bella. I see a message from Viame. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, I want to talking about carbon. I want to know how can the implementation of carbon sequestration initiatives be integrated with the biodiversity conservation efforts to ensure that ecosystem health is preserved while mitigating climate change effects.
I think this is something that we covered previously in this discussion. So I will suggest maybe watching the recording again so that we have time for another question.
Thank you so much, Carly. I see Xiaoshen. Would you like to?
Yes. Thank you. I think I want to ask Bella and Carly. So earlier, from your presentation, you show a scientific study of research showing like which area need to be prioritized or what kind of ecological land, for example, peatland, wetland, and the mangrove, right? So what if these are concentrated species area on the world, but the structure of the biodiversity framework is nation based, right? So how can all the nation work together to focus on the area which need to be prioritized first? Then just and also more just like, oh, when you show those two study, any conclusion or insight you actually want to bring out from those two slides. I think that's the biodiversity importance and also the carbon stock area. Yeah.
So I'll take the first stab at this. So first of the main message that we got from this study is that the solutions to biodiversity loss and climate change that are nature-based are found in the same places. The same places in countries that provide high biodiversity are usually the same places that store the most carbon. And so prioritizing action in those places is the best way that we can make the most bang for our buck. There's not a lot of money that goes into this space. And so we really want to make sure that resources are used effectively and quickly. So if we know where to aim that money, we can hopefully, make good progress on these targets. Can you repeat your first question again?
Yeah, so I think like similar to the climate change kind of discussion, right? There's a loss and damage fund. So my question is like, it seems we are putting that burden because those areas are concentrated on specific countries, right? So how do we help them, right? It's not just like, oh, that's only your issue. You need to solve it by yourself. Of course,
Exactly.
It's not the case. Yeah.
So, I mean, there are countries that are more mega diverse in the world, and that just is what it is. It's the role of the countries that are less mega diverse to, one, identify and prioritize the high biodiversity areas in their own country, which every country does have them, and make sure that the resources that are under national jurisdiction are well taken care of. But it's also then their role to support the conservation, sustainable use, and restoration of the highly mega biodiverse countries. So it really goes into the developed versus developing country role in this framework. Target 19 really kind of encapsulates the commitment that donor governments have made in real funding, like real concrete dollars that have to be shared with the countries that are mega biodiverse so that they can continue to steward these globally important resources. I do think it's important to note that not every country is Brazil, not every country is, Indonesia. My country, the United States, isn't even a full party to this convention, but there is incredibly important biodiversity here that, overlaps with high carbon places. And so getting our own room cleaned up is just as important as supporting the efforts in mega biodiverse countries to, steward those resources.
One thing to add, I think that's exactly right, and we're almost at time, so I'll just make this quick, but the 30 by 30 goal, target 3, is a global goal. So not every country needs to have 30% of its lands and waters protected, but that's a global collective goal. And so all countries should be helping each other to achieve that goal while also prioritizing biodiversity conservation in their own country. Yeah, that's all I'll add.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your questions, and thank you so much to the speakers for your insightful answers. I see more than 25 questions left. I would suggest that I would send it to you as a small PDF where you can choose to answer, and we'll send it back to all the participants here. My last request to everyone before we end the call is to please switch your camera on if you're comfortable with it. We'll take a picture, all attendees together.
Well, people are switching on their cameras. I'll just say that GYBN is also preparing another webinar series in the coming month to go more into implementation and the role of youth in implementation of these policies. So stay tuned for that. And thanks, everyone. I'm happy to answer the questions later. Yeah, I also have a long list of questions.
Thank you so much, Sefa.
Thank you for the questions. They're actually very good questions, and I wish you had more time to answer them. So yeah.
Okay, I'll start taking pictures. Okay, more camera picture on. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Okay, again. 3, 2, 1. Okay, last page. Three, two, one. Okay, I think with this, we come to the end of the second session. Thank you everyone for joining in. We've shared all the links again on the chat, and we'll be sharing more updates on the email. The presentations and the recording links will be shared with all. And thank you so much, Bella, Sefa, and Kali again for being such amazing speakers in the session. And see you all again soon. Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much.